Now, if you've been following along, you know that my buddy recently purchased a rental property in northern Michigan. It wasn't bad when he bought it, but it was pretty dingy looking and outdated. And in this series of videos, I've been renovating it and trying to bring it into the 21st century. In the first video, I made this kitchenette, which houses the fridge, the coffee station, and a microwave. And then I went on to build this awesome vanity, which has some really cool storage solutions on the inside. Well, in this video, I'll be focusing on the bathroom, more specifically, the wall above the toilet. See, my buddy asked me to design and build him a bathroom cabinet, and this is what I came up with. A sort of traditional-looking bathroom cabinet with cubbies to hold towels around the outside. Well, I texted him a picture of it, and he got back to me with this. He didn't really like it. He said it looked too much like a bathroom cabinet. Okay, well, apparently he wants something a bit more modern. So I drew this up, and he said, "We're getting there." And then he took my drawing, he slid it to the side a bit, and he pasted a new copy of it, and literally flipped it upside down and made the shelves line up. And he said, "I want something sort of like this. Can you do that?" So I drew this one up. It's a dual cabinet solution that is connected by shelving. Each cabinet opens up and it has two adjustable shelves on the inside. Then between the cabinets, there's cubbies to store 4 rolled-up towels. Well, I sent this drawing over to my friend, and he gave me the green light. So this is what I'll be making today, a modern-looking bathroom cabinet. Well, let's bring in some lumber and get going. And for that, my neighbor generously left his door unlocked, so today we'll be using some beautiful ash hardwood to make this thing. And if you're new to woodworking, and you're wondering how I was able to identify this wood as ash, it's easy. You just follow the grain with your eye until you see the label at the end of the board, and then you just read it, and that's how I know this is ash. But there are some things that I have to check before getting started, and the most important is the moisture levels of the wood. I gotta make sure it's dry enough to work with, and for that, I use my Wagner pinless meter. This is the Wagner 950. There's no pins. Instead, the sensor for the meter is this entire section on the back of the tool. So there's no poking or stabbing the boards at all. Instead, you just set it down onto your stock and slide it around to take multiple readings. It's really just that easy. So why is this even important? Well, whenever you're dealing with rough-sawn lumber, you gotta make sure it's fully dry before working with it, because the material will change shape and move as it dries. If it's too wet to begin with, it'll shrink and your joints can open up and reveal gaps. Sometimes if the wood isn't dried, cracks and checks can develop. In worst-case scenarios, some boards might even create a bow, a warp, or a twist as they dry and completely ruin your project. So it's always really important to make sure your lumber is dry enough to work with before you start your project. I've been burned by this a number of times in the past now, and I always double-check and make sure before getting started. And a good moisture meter like this one can help you do that. And these pinless ones are really amazing. Just check out how far down it reads. These boards are 4/4, and the reading still changes when I put my hand underneath the material. That's just nuts. But I think my favorite thing about the meter is that it'll yell at you if the board is too wet. Check it out. This board still has a bunch of moisture within it, and the meter beeps at me to warn me that I shouldn't work with it just yet. So if you don't have a moisture meter for your shop yet, then check out the ones over at wagnermeters.com. They're the best in the business when it comes to moisture meters, and they have a lot of options to choose from. All right, now that I've verified that these boards are dry enough to work with, let's get started. So the first thing I gotta do is trim these boards down so they're a more manageable length. Then I can jam them all through my planer and get them from 4/4 down to exactly 3/4 of an inch. And I know once I've gotten them there when my calipers can just barely fit over the material. At this point, I can put one clean edge on the boards over at the joiner. And by removing the safety cover, I can get a real sweet shot of the joiner in action while simultaneously causing all the safety police to have major convulsions and type in mean comments on this video. Then with one clean edge, I can trim all the ugly bits off the boards and get them each down to their desired widths. Now, since the door panels of the cabinets are only going to be a 1/4 inch thick, I can resaw one of these sections in half and get both of the pieces I need from just a single board. I run it through the bandsaw and end up with a nice clean-cut, book-matched pair of thin boards. Next, I did the exact same thing for the back panels of the cabinets. And because I have the Helix cutter head in my planer, I have to put in a riser so that I can plane these boards the rest of the way down. Plus, this gives me a reason to use my Harbor Freight clamps that I have in my shop. These were the very first clamps I ever bought as a woodworker, and they're a humbling reminder of the days when I wasn't nearly this fat and annoying. Now that I got everything down to its final thickness, I can then go through each board and mark out the sections of them that I want to use and which bits that I want to cut off and get rid of. And once I got that figured out, I can head over to the miter saw and chop them all up. Now, all the pieces are the right thickness and widths, but they've only been rough cut to length. So to get them perfect, I like to tape all of the same pieces together so that when I cut them to their final dimensions, I'll know that they're all absolutely identical. And just like that, all the pieces are cut out to their final sizes and we're ready to move on. For joinery, I decided to go with dados and rabbets. I just think it's an easy technique and they produce a very strong joint. Plus, it makes assembly a breeze since all the pieces can just be slid and tapped into place. And they look cool too. So I put my dado stack into the table saw and I cut a bunch of 3/4 inch channels into the top and the bottom pieces as well as the inner sides. For the rabbets, I put on my sacrificial fence and I adjusted it so that I was cutting right on the very edge of the piece. And once I had it perfect, I could then run the outer side pieces through on both ends. With that done, I took the chipper blades out of the stack so that I could cut some 1/4 inch dados for the back panels to fit into on the outer side pieces. And once I cut one, I could grab a scrap piece to make sure it fit. It was a bit snug, but I think I can work with that. Now that we know we're good, I went ahead and I cut the same dado on the inner side pieces. So the top and bottom also need dados cut in, but we don't want them to run all the way down the entire piece because the center area is a shelf, and we don't want that unsightly dado just sitting there doing nothing looking ugly. Same reason my wife tells me to hide in the bedroom when she has friends over. So to do this right, we'll need to make some stopped dados using a router. I clamp down a fence, I load in a 1/4 inch bit, and then I take lots of shallow passes until I have it cut to its full depth. And once I had it cut all the way, I could drop in a piece of scrap to test the fit and then repeat the process 3 more times. Now some of the pieces had knots and inclusions. For the ones with smaller cracks in them, I could just fill them with some CA glue, hit it with some activator, and then sand it flush to smooth them out. This worked fine for most of them, but for the bigger ones, I had to mix up a batch of 5-minute snot. Once I got it stirred up and looking like something I hacked up last flu season, I could drizzle it into the knot and let it cure overnight. And once it had fully hardened, I could sand it flush and then move on to the next step. And that was drilling all the adjustment holes for the inside shelving. I just used this jig and I was able to crank those out in no time. Now we're finally ready to start putting this thing together. I used some right angle brackets to help me keep the sides straight up and down while I was getting them into position. And then I could just add on a few parallel clamps to pull the sides in tight while the glue dried. And once I did dry, I could add some glue and put the inner side pieces into the dados on the bottom. And when I had them lined up just right, I could add on some clamps to make sure that they were fully seated. Next came putting in the 3 shelves. You'd think that these would be pretty easy, but once you add the glue, there's not much wiggle room left. So I had to channel my inner buddy Rich and go to town with the mallet to get them to slide all the way in. Once those were done, I could slide in the back panels, being sure to wear ear protection because we all know how loud back panels can be. And then it was time to put the top on. I added some glue to the rabbets and the dados, put it in place, and then just beat the snot out of it with a mallet until it finally did what I wanted. Hey, it's like what I do with my neighbor. And then, when I had it looking good, I could throw on some clamps to cinch everything closed and then leave it to dry. And once it had dried, I could tip it down onto its back and then use a hand plane to flush up some areas that were just barely uneven. Plus, anytime I can use a hand plane in a video, my street cred goes up. And it helps me justify having one in my logo. But this was super easy. There was just a couple of spots that needed it, and I probably could have done it with a palm sander, but let's face it, it looks way cooler using a hand plane. Now it's time to make the doors, and to do that, I just use a cope and style bit in my router. First, I add the tenons to the rails of the doors using a coping sled. Then I put in the other bit, and I line it up so it matches the height of the tenon that I just made. Then I run every piece across this one to cut in the dado in which the door panel will fit into. Assembly is pretty easy. I just lather up the tenons of the rails and slide them into the ends of the stiles. And once I get both of them in place, I can slide in the inside panel. Then I just add a touch more glue to the other side of the rails, and I drop on the last piece. And then I add a couple of clamps just to close up any gaps. And once they're dry, I give them a good sanding, and then I'm ready to install the hinges. First, I use a jig to help me drill out the location that the hinges will go on the doors. And that's super easy. The tough part is finding out where to mount the other side, since these are frameless, full overlay hinges. To make it easy, I just mounted the hinges on a scrap piece of plywood that was only a couple inches wide. This let me position them exactly like a closed cabinet door, but since it's so narrow, I could still reach inside and mark the locations where I need to mount the hinges. At this point, I could punch a hole at the screw locations. Pay no attention to the plugs in those bottom holes. More on that in the outtakes, with emphasis on moron. And then I can secure in the hinges. After that part, I can unscrew everything off of the template, put them onto the door, and then refasten them onto the cabinet. Next came mounting on the door pulls. And for the last piece to go on, I had to tip my saw blade over to 45 degrees. Now I can cut out several cleats that I'll use to mount this thing onto the wall. 2 of them will be glued to the back of the unit, and then 2 of them will be mounted to the wall. Now for a finish, I like to use this stung oil from Bumbleshoots. I've used it for a ton of other projects, and it's great. It's pretty thick though, so I like to cut it with some citrus solvent. I just do a 1-to-1 ratio, and then I stir it up real good, and that thins it out. Then I just brush it on with a foam applicator, and I keep giving it more until it stops asking for it. It soaks in and cures, giving the wood some great protection, and it sure brings out those rich tones of the wood. I give every surface a couple coats of it, then I leave it overnight to settle in. The next day, I wipe off any excess, and then I buff in this carnauba wax. This is a top layer of protection, and it basically makes this thing very resistant to humidity. Well, now I can drop in the shelves. Clip on the doors, and this thing is done. Now the only thing left is to get it installed. And for that, I tossed it into the truck and I drove up to northern Michigan to the rental property. Once I was there, the first step was to mount these cleats onto the wall. I countersunk some holes in them and drove in some screws so that the tips were just barely sticking out. Then, when I had it positioned just right, I pressed it against the wall to show me where I needed to drill for wall anchors. And for those of you that might be wondering, the flathead screw, yes, that's a flathead screw, it went into a stud. Then once the cleats were mounted, I could just lift up the cabinet and hang it right on them. Perfect. Just check this thing out. It really turned out awesome. The figure of the ash is just gorgeous. Such interesting and vibrant grain patterns on all the pieces. The dado and the rabbit construction really made this go together easily, and it helped me ensure that all the pieces stayed square with one another. The adjustable shelving on the inside is a nice feature, and it allows for this to be configured to store whatever's needed. But I gotta say my favorite feature are these soft close hinges. I just love how gently the doors close all on their own. So that's going to wrap up this one. What a fun project. If you'd like to build this for your bathroom, then head over to fishersshoponline.com and pick up the step-by-step instructions. They're just $5. Well, thanks for watching. I got one more video in this renovation series, so stay tuned for that. And until next time, take care, and I'll see you soon.
Crap, crap, crap. That's not gonna pull together. Well, crapskis. How do I pull it together? Well, it looks like my back panels are about 1/8 of an inch too tall, and it's keeping this top from sitting all the way down. Hot! Wow. Well, crapskis. I don't know if you can see, but the shelf adjustment holes, there's 2 of them right behind the hinge mounting holes. So what I'm going to have to do is cut up some dowels, glue those in, cut it flush so I can mount the hinge. I shouldn't have drilled those 4 holes, but I will.